welcome to the Sage CRM REST API. My name is Conrad and I'll be guiding you through the Sage CRM REST API functions and changes for the next half an hour. I hope you enjoy. The main point of this session is to get you acquainted with the CRM REST API, how the API works and how you can use it to leverage it for your business or your customer. I'm going to be covering what we currently can do with the Sage CRM REST API, how we can do those things, and then most of all, I did a special code demo specifically for this conference to show you guys what is possible and what we can do in a very short time. I will also be making this code available for later use that you as a partner or a client can take this C# code and use it if you like. So let's jump straight into it and get started. What is the Sage CRM REST API? So if you recall, previous versions of CRM had the Web Service API. The Web Service API used a WSDL file, which is the Web Service Definition Language file, to actually describe what the web services can do. If there was a post method or an add company method or anything like that, that would be described in your web service file or your WSDL file. Now with the new modern version of the Web Service API, CRM actually uses the RESTful Web Service API. So what does RESTful mean? Well, think of the RESTful service as a sort of template that the internet standards follow, where the WSDL file, you could always investigate what happens in the WSDL file. For instance, like I mentioned, an add company or remove company or so on. For the RESTful service, it works differently. There is no definition that we can go to. However, there are some standards that we can look at, and that we will be discussing later on in this session. Okay? The other thing that we can take note of the REST API is that it uses the basic authentication or a session ID to connect to your service. When it comes to basic authentication, you can think of that as your username and password encoded to base64, and we send that as an authorization header to the CRM server to then allow us access into CRM and then do any of our operations that we want to do. The REST API also uses a standard template URI, and that basically just means that for the standard of how we communicate with, say, CRM, there will be a basic API and then we add endpoints to that. I will be covering that a little bit later as well. And then the last thing to mention is our HTTP methods. So HTTP methods or HTTP verbs are what we use to communicate. That could be a get, a put, a delete, or a post verb that we use to communicate with the REST API, and I will be covering some of those here as well. So let's have a quick look at those REST API references. So when we speak about the endpoints or resources that we use, and previously I spoke about a template URL, this would be your template URL. We would normally have HTTP or HTTPS, then your server and your port, then SData, which is fixed, then your instance name for CRM or your database name for CRM with a J, and then Sage CRM 2, which is also fixed. That is our schema, if you can call it that. Then it's slash, dash, slash, and then your resource or your endpoint name. Now, some simple examples of that would be HTTP, localhost, SData, and then have the company as my endpoint. This would get me a company where the ID is 1234. We also have the capability to interrogate linked entities like linked people or linked addresses that are linked to a company. You would do that by saying company 1234 / address would give me a list of the addresses that are available for that company. Something to note previously mentioned about the basic authentication is that when you expose your CRM to the internet and you make available your REST API, you should probably be using a HTTPS address. So you should be using a secure address for your CRM. The reason for that is that a call made to the REST API could be intercepted if it's on normal HTTP, and then it will expose your user ID and password that are in the header that you are sending to your REST file. So that is something to note just for security purposes. Previously, I mentioned that HTTP methods or HTTP verbs that we can use to communicate with the REST API. This would be one of those verbs called a get verb. When we look at this, we can see that this is a standard get of a company where the company ID is 1222. It would bring the key, the title, the URL, and then my company fields, which could be comp_company ID, comp_workflow ID, and so on and so forth. The next example I have here is called a post payload. When we use something like post, we can actually send data to the server to add something. So if I want to add a new company, this is how I would add it. Something to note about the REST API is that you will always need to complete a field that is mandatory in CRM, also in the REST API. So if the field company name is mandatory in CRM, it will also be mandatory in the REST API. If the address line, address 1 is mandatory in CRM, so will it be in the REST API. So this is something to note. You would get an error message back from the REST API if you do not complete these values or if you do not set these values accordingly. It would tell you that these fields are required or that they are blank and they should not be blank. This is a tricky example where not only is a company getting added, but also with that company I am adding an address. This can easily be done, and as you see here, if you actually test this, you will see that it does work, but it does not link this address directly to this company. It adds it as two separate entities, and later on we'll be discussing of how we can link these back together again. So let's have a quick chat about the REST dependencies. The REST API in CRM is only dependent on Tomcat. If your Tomcat is not running, your REST API will not work. Okay, as I mentioned, the sData section that we see after localhost in the REST API template URI means that it is getting redirected to Tomcat, which means Tomcat handles our REST API. So if Tomcat's broken or cannot connect to the database, then we would get no values back from the REST API. Also, unlike SOAP, no WSDL is required, so we do not have a schema to work off. So it's very important to go through documentation and to have thorough documentation of what the REST API can do and how we should be doing it in the REST API. The current REST API for CRM is evolving, so the version we have now might not be the same version we have in a year or 2 years' time, as more features get added all the time to make the REST API more robust and easily usable. Now let's quickly have a look at the REST resources. So, some useful resources that you might not know of or might not have seen in documentation are the following. When you need to access all the fields for your entire CRM, including your entities, you can use the prototypes keyword. So it would follow exactly the same URI pattern, but then at the end, instead of saying /company, we would say $prototypes. This would bring me back all the entities that is linked to my current CRM. So if I wanted to see if an entity is discoverable in CRM, I can use the /prototypes to see if an entity comes up. I can also use the /prototypes/entity name to see what fields an entity has. So if I wanted to interrogate the company table to see what comes up in the company table, I can use the /prototypes/entity to see which fields are available in the company table that I can put values to. This would also give you those fields specific types as strings or ints and so on and so forth. Something else to go have a look at is the documentation that's available on help.sagecrm.com/the version number/REST API reference. For mine and for this test purpose, I used 2020 R1, and you can find all the documentation there that's mentioned in the slide. Now let's start by looking at Postman and what we can do in Postman and how we can use it to test if our REST API is working for CRM before we go to our C# code. So I've opened up Postman here, and I can now start looking at my CRM REST API. I created a couple of examples here. However, you will find some examples available from the help.sagecrm.com REST API resources that you can also download. However, I created a couple of my own that we will be looking at today. The first one we're going to go through is the one that I mentioned for /prototypes. So I'm interrogating one of my local VMs here, and you can see that I've got the address in, I've got sdata, CRM 2020J, Sage CRM 2, and then /prototypes. Let's have a look at my authorizations. If I click on authorizations, you'll see that my type is basic auth, and I put in my username and password in this box here. So I have no password for my VM, and my username is admin. Let's have a look and see what happens when I press the send button. Notice that this is on a get method, and when I get my results back, you can see that I've got my base URL, which gives me my URL. I've got my title, which is linked to all prototypes, total results, so this would be amount of entities, and then it will give me a list, an array list of entities. So the first one would be address, then address link, and if we continue down, you can see that there's campaigns and cases and so on. Each of these also has a resource kind, which is the table name. It's got a URL and then a resource ID. That would be your table ID in CRM. Something to note here that has been logged with the development team is that currently my URL comes back as an internal representation of my URL and not my external representation. So that is just something to note here. That's all for my prototypes one. Let's look at another one, like the company prototypes. The company prototypes, I did almost the same. I just had the /prototypes and then I do /company. My authorization header is still in there, which is admin and blank password. I'm still passing nothing through in the body or my other headers, and I'm going to hit send. When I get a result back on this, you can see that it is bringing back a properties list. And in this, it shows me all the fields available for the company. So I've got company ID, I've got timestamp, I've got email and workflow ID, and so on and so forth. You'll also see that ones like address, for instance, would show an items and a ref definition. That would tell me that you can have more than one address linked to a company, and I can retrieve all of them through the API as well. The next one in the list that I have is a normal company one. So I drop the prototypes and I'm just saying /company. This would be my company endpoint. We can change this to anything like address, any kind of entity that is exposed to web services, and we will get a response back, and we can test that as well. So let's do for my company first. I'm going to hit send and I should get my values back. As you can see here, I've got some top level values like my URL, first, next and last, which I will explain. And then I've got total results. 1236, which is 1236 records currently in my company table. I've got my start index and I've got my items per page. What this is doing is it's dividing up my call and only bringing back 10 results at a time. So 10 companies at a time that I'm getting back. You can see that also from this URL here, where it says my next would be start index 11 and count equals 10, which means it'll bring back my next 10 records. The reason for this is, so if you're exchanging a lot of data through a REST API, you want to keep it as little as possible, and you don't want to send payloads that are megs and megs and megs large. You want to send a nice streamlined payload. You can change this in the CRM front end in the settings, where you can change it to bring back more items per page, but the default is 10 for this database, and it would always start on the first one because I have no other query string after my company. On the resources, if you have a look at that, you'll see that it comes back with a key, which gives me my company ID, the title, which is the title of the company, and then it follows with the URL and then my company fields. These company fields come through as they are on the database. However, we do get ones like person, where person will give you a reference, similar to how we looked at address. Here I can see that person 17 is linked to this company. So if I change my top here to person and then person 17 as is in that URL and I run that, you can see that it brings back Janet Andrews as the person that is linked to that company. Give me the person ID and then all the person fields. We'll be looking at a company record as well now that does the same. So let's look at a company record specifically. When we open a company record, we do exactly the same thing. Company bracket, single quote, and then the company ID, single quote, and close my bracket. When I hit send here, we can see that it brings back only for that company with my key at the top and my company ID as my company ID. If I go through this, I can see all my fields. I can also then see my person fields that are linked. I can see if there are any channels linked and users and so on and so forth. Now that we've seen that we can see the linked entities, how can we easily interrogate these linked entities? Well, if we look at the address on company example that I have here, you can see that I left my company as is and then just added /address. This is the beauty of the REST API, that we can just add on to the end of it to get extra resources that we need. So if I run this, we will be receiving the addresses that belong to that company. If we look in here, we can see that all the address information is in here. So we've got the address ID 1775, and then if we scroll down, we can see that there's another address ID linked to it as well, and all those associations with the company. From here, you can see that we can go back to the company. Instead of going through the company with the company ID, we can go and take the address ID and say /company, and that would take us to the company for that address. The second last one we're going to look at is called a post. Now, a post is where we add data to CRM. In this case, I'm going to add a company record. Something you do note about posts is that we definitely need a body. So we need to send CRM some information to post for it to be able to add the company. Like I mentioned earlier, is if a field is required in CRM, it is also required in the REST API. For this instance, I used the company, which is company name, and I also added an address. It would be perfectly fine to add it like this as well. So if I hit send, it should just add the company and then bring me the company ID back as my return, and then also my company name. If I added more fields, let's say a company website and so on, then it would also be in this payload at the bottom. Now I could have left that address in there and then also posted, and it would have added an address in as well. So let's put that back quickly and then run this again. So now that I've run this again, you can see that my address resource came back with an ID as well. That means that it added the address successfully and it added the company as well. So you can see my company is up by one number and I also have a new address as well. In this case, the address is not directly linked to this company. We need to fill in the field for primary address ID. That would have linked the address to this company as well. But because we don't know what the current address ID is, if we add a new address, we can do that with a put method. So if we take that address ID and we go to our put method, once we're in our put method and we go to the body, we can see that I've got my company website and I've got my company primary address ID. The other thing that we have to note about a put method is that we have to include which company we are going to change. So a put effectively is a change to a specific company. There is another method called a patch method that is also available on the Sage CRM REST API, but in this case we are just going to use a put. So I'm telling the REST API that I want to change company 1241 and I want to add company website, and I also want to add the newly created address to that company. If I hit send now, it comes back and it says key 1241, which is the one that we did with a status of 200, which means it went through successfully. It added the company primary address ID to it, and it also changed the website. Now that we are done with Postman, let's have a look at our C# code and our C# demo, what this whole presentation is about. So looking at the top of this project, we can see that I've got 3 using statements here. 2 of them refer back to my class library, my REST API, and then 1 just refers to my local models. So I created some local models here to show you how it works, and then I've got some references to the class library. Later on we'll be looking at the class library and how those work, but for now let's quickly look at how we can use this. So the one that's very important is I added a reference to my class library by going to add and then project references and added a project reference in there. You can also, if this gets released as a NuGet package, just include the NuGet package and then add your using statements. So my using statements that are pretty important here is API.reference and API.models. The models I will need to iterate through my return payloads, and then the API.ref interface I will need to speak to my interface classes. So let's look at my main and then let's see what I did here. So for starters, I reference the Sage CRM REST client and I create a new instance of a class called Sage CRM Builder. The Sage CRM Builder class is my intermediate class that handles everything like my base URL, my login credentials, and then I've got a build method. The final build method returns an instance of the Sage CRM implementation class. We'll be looking at the implementation class a little bit later and how we did the HTTP calls. So let's get started. The set base URL sets my base URL that I described in the first slide where we do // That is where we end and we set it as that. The reason for that is when we send up any calls, we'll be sending the appendix of this. So it will be something like /company or /address and so on and so forth. For this case, we'll be using company a lot. The set login credentials, we set my plain text login credentials as admin and a blank password. And then I've got the build method. The build method then returns my instance that gets attached to my client. So let's look at the usage. If I scroll down, I've got a couple here. I've got my gets, my posts, my puts, and my deletes. Let's look at my gets for now. I'm going to uncomment that line so that I can run my get. And I'm going to look at get entities. So the first one I did here for get entities is I'm using a method on my client, my CRM REST client, called get all entities. What get all entities does is it runs the prototype method. So as I showed you in previous slides, the prototype method brings back all the entities available on my Sage CRM instance. And that is what this will do. So if I run this, we'll see that it brings back a list of all my entities. So when I run this, it will bring back a list of all the entities that are currently in my CRM system. So if we have a look at the code quick, we can see that I'm doing a var as a return type, but that is telling me that it comes from prototypes. So I created a model called prototypes, and prototypes brings back that for me. There is a list in prototype called entity list, and I'm getting the entity name of entity list. However, if you choose not to use the prototypes class and you want to use your own class, you can do so with a custom return type. This custom return type is a class that I created locally in my model called Protos class, and the Protos class just has the title and the total result. While we're in here, I can explain how the JSON property works. One of the new classes added to .NET is the system text JSON serialization, and this can make use of the JSON property name, where I can pick up any JSON property name and then map it to any other name that I want in C#. So for instance, total results I can do as results amount. However, the types do need to match. Okay, back to our class, here you can see that I'm calling Protos class, creating a new instance of that, and then saying get all entities, but by using generics, I'm saying bring back the Protos class for me as a return type and give me the title of the Protos class. So if I run this now, we will see that it comes back with just the title of that specific list. Link to all prototypes, which is just the title. So if I go back into Postman and I look at that prototypes, the title given there is link to all prototypes. And that is the value that I'm returning here. The next one we'll be looking at is entity fields. So I created another special method called getEntityFields, which gets all the fields that's related to a specific entity. You'll also see that this has a return type of entity fields, not to be confused with entity field, which is one of my local models. So for entity fields, let's do a quick modification here and then run it and then see what happens. So all I'm going to do is say, use my string interpolation here, put in my key, and then my value I'll just add here at the back. Let's do it like that, and then I can get rid of this one altogether, and then we can have a look at this. The first thing that you'll notice is that I'm calling a key value pair, which is a dictionary type, and I'm calling a string with another special type called a field. A field is also one of the models in the API class. And then you'll see that I'll be calling entities.fields. So let's look at what the output will show me. There you can see, ladies and gents, for the company field, I'm getting all my company types back. So it will show me my company timestamp, and it'll tell me it is a date time, company ID, which is an integer, and all through all those company fields. As opposed to the previous, the getEntityFields takes one parameter, and that parameter is my entity name. So this could be company, it could be address, or anything else, and it should bring back my values for that specific entity. You can do the same again with getEntityFields and then use a generic of your own type. So getEntityField is the generic that I created here. And if we look at that, it just has the title and it's bound to $title, which will then bring back my title. So no need to use my interpretation of it. You can then just pass in a generic and that will bring back the value for you like. The next one we're going to look at is now just a normal get. So when we use get, we can either pass in an ID or we can just pass in the company or the entity that we're looking for. So if we do this, this will bring back a model called multiple record, which means I get back a lot of records from this, and the multiple record will print out my record ID and my record name. The records is a list of single records within this. So let's run this and see what this looks like. Here we see the output as the company ID and then the company name. As previously mentioned, you'll see that it only brings back the first 10 records. You can do the same with the generic for the get method by passing in your own local model. So in this case, I created a company local model that I passed through to get my values back. The only difference you notice here is that for this get, I pass a null value as my second parameter, and that is an in parameter that could be an ID. So when using this specific one, we have to pass either a null value or an ID through. So let's look at that quickly and see what that looks like. If I open this, we'll see that here in this case, we are calling company and we're calling the company ID 1222. You'll see that my return type is a single record. Let's look at what this single record return type looks like. We see that we get the record ID and the name and the URL, and then there is a fields property. This fields property is of type string object of iDictionary. This brings back all my fields so that it can easily be iterated through in the program. And then of course there is a generic type for that as well, which is the get company, and instead of passing a null value, I actually pass in an ID and it will come back as a company type. Let's look at the last few here. So looking at the posts, I can either create a new model and then give it a value like that for the company name, and then do a client.add add, which is another method, and I pass through my company object and I tell it I want to add it on the entity company. However, if you look at this, you can see that the entity name is inherently null, and that's because if I pass nothing in there and it does read that it is of type company, it will try insert into the endpoint company. The second one we can do is if we don't want to use models and we want to use string data like raw JSON, we can do that as well. Inside the add implementation, it will actually convert it and then send it through as JSON correctly to the server. The next one is the put model. If we look at the company put model, I did a similar thing there. But here, instead of passing just the model, I have to pass the ID, the model, and then also the entity that I'm posting on. But if you look at this again, you can see that the entity can also be null. So if it was only called company and I added no entity name at the back, it would have worked as well. And the last one we can look at is the delete method. So here we just have delete and we pass in what we need to delete. If we pass in the model as a generic model, then you'll see that it does not need the model at the end or does not need my entity name at the end, but it would always need the ID of which one to delete. Let's have a brief look at what the REST API class library looks like. In the layout, we've got helpers, implementation, interface, and models. The helpers consist of my HTTP helpers, which is my response wrapper, my HTTP service, and my IHTTP service. We'll be working with the IHTTP service, however, the implementation sits in HTTP service. Here, there are some defaults that I set for JSON serialization, like property class name, case insensitive, ignore null values, and allow trailing commas. You can see here, everything that's done, including the deserialization and serialization of the objects. Next up is the implementation, and this is the class where I send everything to my HTTP service class. The interface class is the one that we'll be using a lot because this is where the CRM REST client sits at, and all my methods are here, all my gets and my adds and my deletes, and also my builder class is in here, so you do not need to have a using statement for implementation. You only need a using statement for interface, and if you are using my models, you would need one for models as well, where you can see all the models here. So that is it for my small demo on Postman and my C# code demo. Next up, we'll look at the references, and this C# code will be put up on the Sage GitHub under this address, sage_crm_rest_API_client. And there will also be a blog about this code in the Sage CRM Global Solutions CRM Hints, Tips, and Tricks blogs. Please go have a read at that, and thank you so much for your time today.